So, first of all, I want to thank you all for letting me to come and be with you this morning. I have been at All Saints Church several years ago for a couple of times, but always down in the traditional service. So I've never been up here, so I was so excited to come and see this space. So it's a little bit lopsided. I feel like I need to talk to this choir over here, but then I don't want to miss you all either sitting over here. So if you see me go like this, you'll know what I'm doing, is trying to be inclusive of everybody, you know? Isn't that what we're about? Being inclusive of everybody, right? So there was this family that had this band of brothers, you know, and they got along. It seems they got along pretty well until they didn't. But when that last little one was born, a few years later, after the last little one was born, this band of brothers became jealous over one. And it wasn't just a little bit of jealousy. You know, I kind of would like that candy bar that they have, and I think I'll take it. It was really deep envy. You know what envy is, isn't you? You know, envy is so that my hands are empty. I want your hands to be empty. My heart is empty. I want your life. I want your heart to be empty. So envy is really not just saying, I want the candy bar from somebody else, but it's saying, I want you destroyed. And these brothers, this band of brothers, they felt as if their father didn't love them anymore because favoritism seems to have reared its head. So the band of brothers took Joseph off into this wilderness place, and they found this amazing ditch. Or did they dig it themselves? I don't know for sure. And somehow this great big pit was there, and the band of brothers decided, we're going to take what he deserves. You see how we can always justify what we want to do to the other person? Because the band of brothers probably thought, Joseph really deserves this, and he's got his comeuppance. It wasn't that the boys just lied to Joseph or lied about Joseph. They wanted his life. They thought their lives would be so much more enriched without him. So they went back, and they didn't know this fact, but they decided they'd make it true. They went back to Papa, and they said, guess what? Your beloved son, Joseph, has died. They didn't even care about how much pain they inflicted upon Papa. You know, it's life-altering lies. It's those that are seeking for themselves, not caring about anybody out here, that create havoc. But by the time we get to today's text, I mean, that's gone from chapter 37 to now we're in 45. So I gave you the quick version, Brenda's version of several chapters there, you know. And so when we get to today's version, by this time, Joseph was a slave for 13 years. And when they found out that Joseph could interpret dreams, that didn't free him. He stayed in prison for 2 more years, 15 years total of his life. And then he was brought up to the high places in the high court of Pharaoh. It is a long journey often from anger and bitterness, resentment, fear, dare I use the word hate, to that moment of reconciliation, forgiveness, loving our enemies. Because even though they were thick in blood relation, don't be fooled. They were enemies. Especially in those early days when you're in the pit, when you're really hurt and wounded. It leaves a mark on us. It takes a long time sometimes for us to move from that place into being able to love. But that's what Jesus calls us to in Mark 6, right? Jesus says, love your enemies. Is Jesus crazy? I don't know about you, but sometimes I've had some folks that have just so skewered my heart and raked it over the coals. I didn't want to love my enemies. Didn't they get what they deserved? And yet, our gospel calls us to love our enemies. How did Joseph do it? How did Jesus do it? See, Jesus is calling us to be Jesus, apostrophe, love. So it's not saying Jesus is calling us to imitate Jesus' love, but Jesus is telling us to become Jesus' little loves on earth, so that Jesus' love within us radiates out of us to others. We become that heart. We become that embrace. We become those words of God's love for others. Is Jesus crazy? Can we do that? Is that story about the band of brothers and Joseph real? I mean, it's just a Bible story after all anyway, you know? And those Bible people, they're not realistic, right? Or are they? So how is it that Joseph or any one of us moves from chapter 37, from the interaction of our woundedness, from our broken spirit, to being able to love our enemies, to forgive and to be reconciled in new ways? I could say I don't know, but I've studied a lot on this text, but more importantly, I've lived a lot. I mean, I'm a mother, a grandmother, child, parent, friend. I've had a lot of people in and out of my life. I bet you have too. So it is in the school of real life that we learn some of these things about the way to move from our deep, deep woundedness to loving our enemy. Maybe it can go quick. But maybe like Joseph, it'll take us 15 years, 20 years. I don't know. One of the things I found is to deepen our trust of God. You know, I was ordained in 1988. I know that feels like a long time ago, a lifetime ago, right? For me. And I really believed for the years before that and the years following that I trusted in God. But then came a moment in ministerial life for me. I'm in the United Methodist Church, don't worry. We have full reciprocity with the Lutheran Church, so it's okay for me to preside here. So, but one difference that's very different, you all are on a call system. You have a new pastor coming next week, I understand, and you've gone through a whole call process for 19 months. I'm appointed. My bishop says, go there. You know? And so I did that for nearly 30 years until I came in and sat with my bishop and said, I know I'm guaranteed an appointment. I'm guaranteed a congregation and a salary and a house and insurance and all of that stuff, unless I say no. Because I had felt so sure that God was calling me beyond a local church situation for pastoring. And I founded this ministry, Living Streams Flowing Water, Spiritual Formation Ministry. I put all my favorite things together. What else can you do? Preaching and teaching and spiritual direction and coaching and retreats and all that stuff, And lo and behold, my bishop said, okay. So here I was, out in the real world for the first time in my adult life. I was ordained in 1988, right? And so here I was in the real world without a house, without an income, without insurance, without payments going into a pension program anymore. That's when I learned about trust of God. I always thought that I trusted God, and I relied on that, but this was like everyday life, right? Where am I going to go? And lo and behold, for only a handful of days, I'll say 5, but I don't remember 5, but I'll say 5 just to be safe, did I panic that whole 365 days of that first year. One of those times I was sitting in my car at the mailbox thinking, I know there's going to be more bills in there. When I get the mail today, how in the world am I going to pay for those? And I did the most thing I could think of to do. I just started bawling and praying. I don't know how I'm going to live out here in this real world. I don't know what I'm going to do. Finally, God's like, if you could just trust me a little bit more. I'm telling you, I've got this covered. I didn't call you out here to fall you off over the edge of a cliff into nothing, right? So I finally got brave enough, and I got out, and I got the mail out of the mailbox, and guess what? Are you ready for this? There was a check, a significant check, in the mailbox. Do you know who it was from? The IRS. Do you know when it was from? About 5 years ago, they decided that there was a thing, and they gave me this money back. And I was like, I am so sorry that I doubted you, because you can find money anywhere, right? Think for a moment. How do you trust God? Give us this day our daily bread, our provisions. Another way that we move from chapter 37 to chapter 45 is through those 15 long years is to realize that God forgives us our littlest indiscretions and our great big messes. Because when we are looking at our own humanity, the reality is each and every one of us, maybe it's just me, so I should only speak for myself, that I have messed up. Sometimes I speak words that I don't even know are going to be hurtful to somebody. Unintentionally, I hurt them. I don't ever remember being very, very malicious to anybody, but that doesn't mean I didn't do it sometime, right? To know that I'm forgiven And you are too if you've ever been in those places of unintentionally hurting another. We are forgiven. And the deeper we're aware of that, the more we're able to forgive. There is a great joy in knowing the gifts of God for us. It is a joy that just alters everything about our world view. And in this season of our world, for some it feels pretty darn scary and dark. I was just telling, oh, there she is. I'm thinking, where did she go? Stephanie, right? Oh, good. I was just telling Stephanie that a friend of mine in Gehenna goes to a Gehenna church and knew about the parents that got deported while the children were in school. And the children were left orphaned that day by a governmental decree. There's joy, even in the darkness of chapter 37 in the pit. And so, how do we know? How do we know deep in the deepest parts of ourselves to live as Jesus' little love on earth as it is in heaven? It's an intentional choice, my friends. And sometimes it's not a choice that we feel, but it's a choice that we, as disciples of Jesus, long to live in our hearts. It's letting people take your coat and offering them your t-shirt as well, becoming very vulnerable, so close up to the hurt of others that they can slap our cheek. They can reach us with just an arm's length to harm us. It's amazing that God gives us with restraint. When someone rages at us and drags our heart through their muck and their mire and tries to destroy our personhood. It happens in our personal lives. It happens in our communal lives. And for many in this moment, we're seeing it happen on our national and global scale. That's a whole other sermon that we could get into. God's restraint gives us a gift of slowing. Slow to anger. Slow to condemn. A slow process from chapter 37 through 15 years to chapter 45. The gift of God's presence in slowing. What happens during those 15 years? What is God doing anyway? I teach at the seminaries. I've taught at 3 different ones. And what I most often teach is a class called Spiritual Formation that talks about how God is shaping us on the inside of our character and our mannerisms, our attitudes, and our outward-facing actions. So spiritual formation and prayer is what I've been teaching for 15 years in seminaries. What I've found is I use a definition of spiritual formation by the late Robert Mulholland Jr., who's published a book called Shaped by the Word, a long time ago, about 20 years ago, page 25. And it says it's a process. It's not something that happens overnight, that we become more Christ-like. Process to be more nearly conformed to the image of Christ. We become more Christ-like in our thinking, in our feeling, in our doing. But he doesn't stop there. process to be more nearly shaped to the image of Christ, here's the big thing: for the sake of others. It's not so that you and I can get to heaven. It's so that you and I can be little loves of God, so that the other can be even more Christ-like in their life. You see, what was happening between chapter 37 and 45 is that God is also working on the inside, this inside shaping, this inside formation of our attitudes and character in us, and the one that just ripped our heart out and stomped at it and threw us in the pit. Jesus says to us, don't let your love be captive to your wounds. He says, but I say to you who are listening, are you listening? Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, and bless those who curse you, for those who mistreat you. Love your enemies. How is God inviting you this day to love as Jesus loves? Amen.